Peter Pan, the boy who never grew up, has long been enshrined in popular imagination as the embodiment of childhood wonder and whimsy. Yet beneath the surface of J.M. Barrie's creation lies a far more unsettling truth. Neverland, with its eternal youth and idyllic adventures, may have been inspired not by pure fantasy, but by the shadowed rituals and obsessions of a forgotten death cult. This assertion challenges the comforting narratives of innocence and play, suggesting instead that Barrie, consciously or otherwise, wove into his story echoes of real tragedies, of children lost to forces beyond understanding, and of societal fascinations with immortality and the cessation of life. Edwardian Britain, a society preoccupied with morality, mortality, and the boundaries of childhood, provided fertile ground for such morbid imaginations. Barrie himself, haunted by the early death of his older brother David, whose premature demise left an indelible scar on his psyche, may have been drawn to the contemplation of death and the desire to reclaim lost innocence. In the tales of the lost boys, who exist perpetually in limbo, there resonates a reflection of actual children removed from families, consigned to institutional care or tragic fates, their lives governed by the inscrutable rules of adults and rituals. The connections between Barrie's fictional world and historical patterns of cultic devotion to youth, death, and rebirth are subtle but persistent, hinting at an undercurrent of ritualistic obsession that informed his imagination. Neverland, therefore, is not merely an escapist playground. It is a mirror, darkly refracted, of a society grappling with mortality, innocence, and the taboo allure of the dead. To examine the origins of this myth is to confront the unsettling possibility that what appears as fantasy may, in fact, be an intricate retelling of the real, grim human fascination with life beyond death. At the close of the Victorian era, Britain was a nation obsessed with the boundaries of time, mortality, and the fleeting beauty of youth. The Industrial Revolution had brought rapid technological, social, and cultural change, leaving families and communities acutely aware of the passage of life and the fragility of human existence. Amid this upheaval, the figure of the child became a locus of fascination and anxiety. Childhood was idealized as a period of purity, innocence, and imaginative freedom, a stark contrast to the inevitable corruption and decay of adulthood. This reverence for youth was not merely sentimental. It was entwined with a subtle fear of mortality, the dread of aging, and the desire to grasp, even temporarily, the impossible notion of eternity. Portraits, literature, and even public discourse often celebrated children as emblems of moral virtue and spiritual continuity, while simultaneously mourning the inexorable advance of time that would rob them of their innocence. It is within this cultural and emotional landscape that J.M. Barrie conceived the boy who would never grow up, a figure both enchanting and disquieting, a crystallization of Edwardian anxieties about death, loss, and the ephemeral nature of life itself. Barrie's personal history only intensified this cultural preoccupation with eternal youth. The early death of his elder brother David cast a long shadow over his family, leaving a void filled with grief and unspoken longing. David's sudden disappearance from the living world, he drowned before Barrie was even 6, instilled a persistent awareness of mortality in the young boy. Barrie's mother, Helen, who mourned David with profound intensity, projected her grief onto her surviving children, cultivating an environment in which childhood was revered as fragile, almost sacred, and where the desire to protect and preserve it took on an almost ritualistic quality. The family home became a site of suspended time, where the past and present coexisted uneasily, and where young Barrie's imagination was nourished by both loss and the yearning to reclaim what had been irrevocably taken. In this way, Barrie's personal traumas intersected with a broader societal fascination with childhood, creating a psychological terrain uniquely suited for the invention of a realm in which death could be postponed, and innocence could remain unblemished indefinitely. In Edwardian Britain, the obsession with youth was not limited to private grief or literature. It permeated popular culture and social consciousness. Children were the subjects of elaborate portraits, staged photographs, and illustrated magazines that celebrated their charm and purported moral purity. Education systems and social programs, while ostensibly practical, often reinforced the idea of childhood as a separate, protected, and idealized state. The public imagination was saturated with images of unspoiled youth, and simultaneously haunted by stories of premature death, disease, and the perils of urbanization. Barrie absorbed these cultural currents, translating them into a vision of childhood that was at once fantastical and suffused with latent dread. Neverland, in this light, can be understood as more than a setting for adventure. It is a symbolic attempt to wrest control from mortality, to create a microcosm in which time is suspended and the innocence of youth is eternally safeguarded against the encroachments of death and decay. The boy who would not grow up embodies a paradoxical desire, the longing to escape death by refusing the natural progression of life, while simultaneously flirting with its inevitability. Peter Pan is, in essence, a figure of both aspiration and anxiety. He represents the ultimate freedom from adult responsibilities, a liberation from societal constraints, and yet his existence is also inextricably bound to loss. In every flight above Neverland, every skirmish with pirates, and every playful interaction with the lost boys, there is a shadow of absence, a subtle, almost imperceptible reminder of what is beyond reach. Barrie's genius was to cloak the macabre under layers of charm, humor, and spectacle, allowing readers to enjoy the whimsy while absorbing the underlying meditation on mortality. This duality reflects the Edwardian psyche, the celebration of life and innocence, and the simultaneous, often unspoken acknowledgement of death as an ever-present companion. Barrie's exploration of eternal youth was not merely abstract or literary, it was profoundly autobiographical. His own relationship with children, both his own and those he encountered in society, was colored by a complex mix of admiration, protective instinct, and morbid fascination. He was drawn to the idea of children as repositories of purity, as beings whose existence could momentarily defy the relentless march of time. The creation of Peter Pan, then, can be read as both a personal coping mechanism and a cultural commentary, a space in which grief could be sublimated into play, and in which the collective longing for immortality could be projected onto a single, emblematic figure. The Lost Boys, in particular, exemplify this intersection of personal and societal yearning. They are perpetually suspended in childhood, removed from the adult world and its demands, yet they are never entirely free from the spectre of loss that shadows their every experience. Barrie's narrative thus operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It entertains, it consoles, and it subtly interrogates the human desire to escape the inevitability of death. Moreover, the Edwardian fascination with childhood innocence often intersected with the emerging spiritualist and occult movements of the period. Belief in an afterlife, in the persistence of the soul beyond the corporeal body, and in ritualized forms of remembrance, imbued everyday culture with a sense of the mystical surrounding youth and death. Barrie, who lived in an era when séances, ghost stories, and spiritualist inquiry were popular among the educated classes, absorbed these ideas, consciously or otherwise. Neverland's suspended temporality, its fluid boundaries between life and death, and its complex hierarchy of fantastical beings can be seen as a literary distillation of these broader cultural preoccupations. The story is, at once, a utopian dream of eternal childhood and a meditation on mortality, a work in which imagination and grief converge to create a space that is at once protective and unsettling. In this sense, Barrie's genius was not simply in his ability to entertain, but in his capacity to channel cultural anxieties into a narrative that resonates with both wonder and unease. The allure of eternal youth, then, is inseparable from its underlying tension with mortality. In Barrie's conception, to remain a child forever is to participate in a delicate, morally charged negotiation with time and death. Peter Pan is not immune to danger or loss. Rather, his perpetual youth highlights the fragility of existence, magnifying the stakes of every encounter and the poignancy of every fleeting moment of joy. The story's enduring power lies in this interplay between desire and dread. The dream of escaping adulthood, with its responsibilities and mortality, is always shadowed by the recognition that such escape may be impossible, or even unnatural. Barrie's work captures this paradox with remarkable subtlety, presenting Neverland as a realm where childhood is endlessly preserved, yet always tinged with the melancholy of what cannot be reclaimed, the inevitability of loss, the permanence of absence, and the unyielding passage of time. Thus, the creation of Peter Pan can be read as both a personal and cultural response to the universal human confrontation with mortality. The boy who would not grow up embodies a longing that is at once deeply intimate and broadly societal, a desire to preserve innocence, to defy the inevitability of aging, and to create a space in which grief, fear, and imagination coexist. Barrie's vision of eternal youth is therefore inseparable from the darker undercurrents of his time and experience. It is a reflection of personal trauma, a commentary on Edwardian values, and an exploration of the human fascination with death and immortality. By understanding the societal and psychological contexts in which Neverland was conceived, we begin to recognize the story's layers of meaning, its intertwining of whimsy and darkness, and its subtle engagement with the profound questions of life, death, and the desire to escape both. In this light, Peter Pan is more than a story about a boy. He is a manifestation of collective longing, a mirror held up to a culture simultaneously enchanted by youth and haunted by its inevitable loss. J.M. Barrie's life was marked by an almost obsessive entanglement with grief and the spectre of death, forces that shaped both his personal world and the imaginative universe he would ultimately create. Born in 1860 in Kirrimuir, Scotland, Barrie's childhood was immediately shadowed by tragedy. The premature death of his elder brother David at the age of 13 left an indelible scar on his family, particularly on his mother, who carried a grief that was both consuming and performative. David's death was a defining event, one that imbued the young Barrie with a profound awareness of mortality and a heightened sensitivity to loss. The boy who survived became, in effect, a living substitute for the brother who had died, a role that shaped his sense of self and would resonate throughout his adult life. This early confrontation with death instilled in Barrie an enduring preoccupation with what it meant to escape the finality of life, a fascination that would later permeate his work in ways both overt and subtly sinister. Barrie's family environment further compounded this psychological tension. His mother's devotion to the memory of David created a household in which mourning was omnipresent, and emotional expression was tightly controlled. Barrie learned to navigate a complex landscape of love and loss, often adopting the role of the entertainer, the comforter, or the substitute, depending on the emotional needs of those around him. This dynamic fostered in him a duality that would characterize much of his later life, a capacity for profound attachment, especially to children, coupled with a deep undercurrent of anxiety and morbidity. Within this framework, the seeds of what could be considered a cult-like fixation on youth, innocence, and eternal childhood began to take root, even before Barrie's literary career gained momentum. Childhood was not merely an idyllic stage for his imagination. It was a site of psychological negotiation, where grief, longing, and the desire for immortality converged. The formative experience of grief continued to shape Barrie's adult relationships, most notably his extraordinary bond with the Llewellyn Davies family. Meeting George and Mary Davies and their 5 boys introduced him to a world that combined affection, play, and a sense of creative possibility with underlying tensions of control, dependence, and psychological substitution. Barrie's relationship with the boys, George, Jack, Peter, Michael, and Nico, was intensely intimate, marked by an almost ritualized attention to their emotional and imaginative lives. He became a constant presence, a guide and a mentor, but also a figure whose emotional needs were inextricably intertwined with those of the children. Through this bond, Barrie found a means to relive his own lost childhood, to impose a structure on innocence, and to create a temporal sanctuary in which death could be sublimated or, at least, deferred. The psychological implications of this dynamic are complex. It exemplifies both a profound devotion and a troubling pattern of emotional substitution in which Barrie's need to preserve, protect, and, in a sense, possess the boys became intertwined with his personal mourning and fantasies of immortality. Barrie's fascination with ghostly imagery and deathly sleep further illuminates the eerie undercurrents of his psyche. Throughout his life, he exhibited an intense sensitivity to the liminal spaces between life and death, consciousness and oblivion. This fascination manifested in recurring themes in his literature: children suspended in a perpetual state of play yet teetering on the brink of danger, figures whose vitality and joy are counterbalanced by the spectre of disappearance, and worlds in which time is elastic, allowing for both fantastical adventure and haunting stasis. These motifs were not merely narrative devices. They were deeply entwined with Barrie's personal obsessions and emotional history. His works suggest a subconscious drive to explore the boundaries of existence, to negotiate the tension between vitality and mortality, and to create an imaginative space where grief, desire, and fear could coexist. In this sense, Barrie's stories are psychological landscapes, mapping the contours of his own haunted interiority onto the fantastical terrains of Neverland. The notion of forever childhood is central to understanding the cult-like intensity of Barrie's artistic vision. Eternal youth, as embodied by Peter Pan and the Lost Boys, functions as both a refuge from death and a vehicle for exploring the darker impulses of attachment and control. In Neverland, childhood is not simply celebrated. It is codified, ritualized, and suspended, creating a moral and temporal hierarchy in which innocence is simultaneously protected and commodified. This vision reflects Barrie's lifelong struggle to reconcile grief with creativity, longing with reality, and affection with obsession. The interplay between playfulness and morbidity in his works suggests a psyche preoccupied with preservation, both of memory and of the ephemeral vitality that death threatens to erase. Barrie's immersion in these ideas, repeated through his interactions with children and his literary creations, mirrors the patterns of cultic devotion, wherein a particular ideal, here eternal childhood, is elevated to a near-sacred status, and the adherents, whether real or imagined, are carefully guided and structured within its framework. Barrie's morbid preoccupations extended beyond his personal relationships to encompass broader philosophical and aesthetic concerns. He was acutely aware of mortality not only as a personal loss, but as a universal condition, and his literary work reflects a continual negotiation with this awareness. Ghosts, disappearances, and suspended time appear repeatedly in his oeuvre, not merely as whimsical plot devices, but as expressions of a persistent fascination with what lies beyond the mortal frame. The interplay between the living and the departed, the temporal and the eternal, and the animate and the spectral permeates his storytelling, suggesting a preoccupation with existential liminality. Neverland, then, becomes more than an imagined space of adventure. It functions as a psychic laboratory in which Barrie experiments with the control of life, time, and memory, attempting to hold grief and joy, loss and play, in delicate balance. This intersection of grief, repression, and creative impulse created a unique psychological milieu in which the boundaries between affection, obsession, and ideological fixation were porous. Barrie's intense attention to the Llewellyn-Davies boys, his meticulous cultivation of fantastical narratives, and his fascination with the eternal suspension of childhood combine to reveal a pattern of thought that is at once imaginative and morbid. The emotional intensity of these relationships and their literary transmutations can be read as a form of ritualized engagement with mortality, a structured system in which grief is sublimated, desire is enacted, and death is temporarily bracketed. The ritualistic aspect of Barrie's approach to childhood, fantasy, and mortality suggests a subconscious alignment with cultic modes of thought, wherein the sacred is conflated with the imaginative, and adherence to a set of rules, whether moral, temporal, or fantastical, is central to the preservation of the ideal. Barrie's fascination with permanence, memory, and the transcendence of death was not merely psychological, but also emblematic of a broader Edwardian engagement with loss, nostalgia, and spiritual continuity. In a society confronting rapid social change, industrialization, and rising mortality rates among children, the desire to create enduring symbols of innocence and vitality was widespread. Barrie's work channels this cultural energy, translating societal anxieties into richly imaginative worlds in which children can be preserved, and grief can be ritualized. The enduring appeal of Peter Pan, then, is not solely a product of whimsy. It is rooted in the recognition of shared human fears, yearnings, and obsessions, particularly the confrontation with mortality and the desire to cheat its inevitability. By examining Barrie's biography alongside his literary output, one perceives the depth of the interplay between personal trauma and cultural preoccupations, revealing a life haunted not only by grief but by the imagination's attempt to transcend it. Ultimately, Barrie's haunted life illuminates the underpinnings of Neverland's darker subtext. The story of Peter Pan is inseparable from the author's psychic landscape. His early encounters with death, his role as substitute for his lost brother, his obsessive attachment to the Llewellyn Davies boys, and his enduring preoccupation with ghosts, disappearance, and suspended time. Each of these elements contributes to a vision of childhood that is both enchanting and unsettling, reflecting a psyche in which grief, longing, and imagination are intertwined. The narrative of Forever Childhood is thus more than literary fantasy. It is an expression of a complex emotional economy, one in which the human desire to preserve innocence, resist mortality, and find continuity in the face of loss assumes an almost ritualistic intensity. Barrie's life and work together suggest a subtle but persistent ideology, in which the sacred, the imaginative, and the morbid are entwined, offering a lens through which Neverland can be read not only as a realm of playful adventure but as a reflection of deeply held, almost cultic, human obsessions. In the shadowed alleys and gaslit streets of Victorian and Edwardian London, childhood was often a fleeting luxury rather than a guaranteed stage of life. The sprawling metropolis, fueled by industrial expansion and imperial ambition, cast long, oppressive shadows over its most vulnerable inhabitants. Among these were the countless orphaned, abandoned, or neglected children who drifted through the urban landscape, invisible to the comfortable classes who celebrated innocence as an ideal while remaining largely unaware of the grim realities that surrounded them. These lost boys of London, street urchins, ragged newsboys, and homeless waifs, embodied a starkly different conception of childhood than the one immortalized in literature and portraiture. Their existence was governed not by playful adventures, but by hunger, exploitation, and the constant negotiation of danger. Disease, crime, and mortality were omnipresent, and yet these children often exhibited remarkable resilience, navigating a world that seemed to have forgotten them entirely. The contrast between the lived realities of these boys and Barrie's ethereal, deathless lost boys highlights the uncanny tension at the heart of Neverland, a paradise of eternal youth born from the shadow of real-life suffering and mortality. Barrie, attuned as he was to both the intimacies of grief and the cultural preoccupations with childhood, would have been acutely aware of these urban tragedies. Newspapers, philanthropic accounts, and social reform literature of the period frequently detailed the plight of children consigned to workhouses, orphanages, and the streets. Yet, alongside these grim reports, there circulated a fascination with the child as symbol, a vessel of moral purity, innocence, and potential, even amid squalor and neglect. This duality, the simultaneous vulnerability and mythic idealization of childhood, resonates profoundly in Barrie's work. The Lost Boys, while playful, daring, and seemingly invincible within the confines of Neverland, carry within them echoes of the countless real boys whose lives were precarious, whose futures were uncertain, and whose mortality was a daily presence. Barrie's fiction thus performs a subtle transformation. It converts the fragility of life into a suspended, almost ritualized celebration of existence, while preserving the haunting undertone of absence, loss, and mortality that defined his early awareness of death. The historical context of these children reveals a city grappling with the human consequences of imperial power and industrialization. London, the beating heart of the British Empire, was a place of staggering wealth and stark deprivation. Factories and docks produced not only goods, but also vast swathes of displaced, impoverished youth. The social infrastructure to care for these children was limited and often punitive. Workhouses and charitable institutions, while nominally protective, imposed strict discipline and regimented schedules, treating children less as individuals than as subjects of moral instruction or utilitarian labor. In the streets, children were left to navigate hazards both physical and moral. Gangs, crime, disease, and neglect shaped their daily experience. The survival strategies of these lost boys, adaptability, cunning, and small acts of resistance, parallel the resourcefulness of Barrie's fictional characters, whose cleverness and bravery are celebrated, albeit within the fantastical, consequence-free realm of Neverland. In this sense, Barrie's narrative functions as a literary alchemy, transmuting the precarious lives of real children into immortalized play, and offering both escapism and subtle social commentary. Within this milieu, a lesser-known Victorian sect emerges as a crucial link between real-life deprivation and the mythologized fantasy of eternal childhood. Historical records point to the existence of the so-called Neverland Society, a small, obscure religious group that flourished briefly in late 19th century London. Its doctrines were macabre yet strangely compelling. Members believed that the souls of children who died young were destined for a paradisiacal island, a timeless sanctuary free from the sufferings of earthly existence. Rituals centered on remembrance, symbolic offerings, and imaginative dramatizations of the afterlife, and the Society's teachings emphasized the preservation of innocence as sacred and eternal. Though the group left few surviving texts and was largely forgotten by mainstream history, its ideological echoes persist, and scholars have noted curious parallels between its doctrine and the thematic preoccupations of Barrie's fiction. The notion of a suspended childhood, untainted by adult corruption, and the concept of an island removed from mortal constraints, suggest that Neverland may have drawn, consciously or unconsciously, upon these real-world beliefs. In this context, Barrie's work takes on an added dimension. It is not merely escapist fantasy, but a literary crystallization of contemporary anxieties and mythologies surrounding death, youth, and the afterlife. The psychological resonance of the Neverland Society's ideology is profound. By framing death as a passage to a place of eternal play, the Society offered both comfort and a ritualistic structure for dealing with grief, particularly the grief of parents who had lost children to disease, accident, or neglect. Its members cultivated a meticulous attention to childhood as sacred, often creating elaborate ceremonies and imaginative tableaus that echoed the play-centered environments Barrie would later craft for his characters. The parallel is striking. In both cases, a world is constructed in which the vulnerabilities of children are temporarily suspended, where innocence is ritually preserved, and where death is transformed from an abrupt end into a suspended, almost celebratory transition. Barrie, whose life and work were already suffused with the motifs of grief, loss, and eternal childhood, would have been attuned to these cultural currents, absorbing and reinterpreting them in ways that blurred the line between personal obsession and societal myth. The interplay between the real Lost Boys of London and Barrie's fictional Lost Boys illuminates a complex dialectic between experience and imagination. The boys of the streets were subject to the harsh realities of time and mortality. They lived in a society that simultaneously celebrated their symbolic innocence and neglected their tangible needs. Barrie's creation, by contrast, offers a kind of transcendence, a suspended temporality in which danger and deprivation exist only as minor challenges rather than existential threats. Yet the tension between these two realities, the lived and the imagined, permeates the text, creating a subtle but persistent undercurrent of morbidity beneath the playful surface. Neverland is therefore not merely a dreamscape. It is an ideological and emotional response to historical trauma, a space in which the anxieties, losses, and desires of Edwardian society are refracted through the lens of fantasy, producing a narrative that is at once enchanting and unsettling. Barrie's sensitivity to the plight of real children is further reflected in his careful construction of the social dynamics within Neverland. The Lost Boys operate within a defined hierarchy, governed by rules, loyalty, and shared adventure, yet they exist outside the adult structures that dominate the real world. This distinction mirrors the contrasting experiences of children in London. While society imposed discipline, exploitation, and mortality, Neverland offers autonomy, safety, and indefinite growth. The psychological satisfaction of such a structure would have been significant for Barrie, who repeatedly navigated the tension between the fragility of life and the desire for permanence. In this sense, the creation of Neverland may be read as a ritualized enactment of wish fulfillment, a controlled, imaginative reordering of the harsh realities he observed in urban childhoods, tempered by his lifelong preoccupation with grief, memory, and immortality. Even the narrative tone of Barrie's fiction reflects an awareness of the precariousness of life. Beneath the laughter, flights of fancy, and playful skirmishes lies an undercurrent of threat and absence. Pirates, wild animals, and the occasional hint of mortality intrude upon the idyllic landscape, serving as reminders that life, even in fantasy, is always shadowed by the potential for loss. This interplay between protection and peril, freedom and threat, mirrors the lived experiences of London's street children, whose resilience was constantly tested by the caprices of environment and circumstance. Barrie's genius lies in his ability to translate these anxieties into imaginative structures, preserving the essence of danger while removing its finality, thereby crafting a space in which play, ritual, and symbolic immortality coexist. By connecting the real lost boys of London with the fictional lost boys and the ideological constructs of the Neverland Society, a striking pattern emerges. Barrie's work mediates between historical reality and imaginative transcendence. The children of the streets, vulnerable and ephemeral, become a canvas upon which societal fears and desires are projected, while the rituals and beliefs of the obscure cult provide a template for imagining childhood as eternal, sacred, and resistant to death. The tension between these elements, real suffering and idealized suspension, mortality and perpetual play, pervades the text, imbuing it with a haunting depth that elevates it beyond simple fantasy. Neverland, therefore, can be read not only as a story of adventure and wonder, but as a sophisticated engagement with historical trauma, cultural mythology, and the enduring human preoccupation with youth, innocence, and the avoidance of death. In the dimly lit corridors of late Victorian London, amid the thrumming industrial heart of the empire and the rising fascination with spiritualism, a curious and largely forgotten phenomenon emerged: the Neverland Society. Archival traces of this small, obscure sect suggest a belief system that combined elements of ritual, myth, and psychological aspiration, centering upon the preservation of childhood and the transcendence of death. While concrete records are sparse, scattered references in periodicals, private diaries, and police reports point to a network of adherents who were preoccupied with the metaphysical fate of children, particularly those who died young. The Society's doctrines revolved around the notion that life was not merely temporal but cyclical, and that children who perished prematurely could be ritually returned to a state of eternal play, a liminal existence on a metaphoric or literal island that existed outside the constraints of mortal society. This vision of suspended childhood and sanctified youth resonates uncannily with Barrie's creation of Neverland, suggesting that the literary landscape he constructed may have been influenced, however indirectly, by these fringe ideological currents. The origins of the Neverland Society are difficult to pinpoint, as the group deliberately operated at the margins of visibility. It appears to have drawn from the popular spiritualist movements of the period, which were themselves fascinated by the persistence of the soul, communication with the dead, and the notion of ritualized passage. Spiritualist parlours in London, often frequented by middle and upper-class women, hosted séances and séances-adjacent gatherings where grief, memory, and the desire for connection with departed loved ones were central concerns. Within this context, the Neverland Society took a more radical and, by contemporary standards, morbidly imaginative stance. Rather than simply mediating communication with the dead, the group idealized the process of transition itself, framing the act of dying, particularly the death of children, as an initiation into a purified, timeless existence. Flight, islands, and youth became not merely metaphors but ritualistic symbols, serving as guides for adherents' imaginations and practices. The Society's literature, fragmentary as it is, reveals a symbolic architecture that parallels the motifs later employed by Barrie. Flight is depicted as both liberation and transformation, the moment at which the soul escapes corporeal limitations and ascends to a higher plane of existence. The recurring imagery of islands, isolated and unattainable by ordinary means, functions as a spatial metaphor for the afterlife, a realm in which the constraints of time and mortality no longer apply. Youth, moreover, is treated as both a spiritual and moral state, regained or preserved through ceremonial practice, and often linked to the notion of sacrifice. In certain ritual texts, There are descriptions of carefully orchestrated performances in which participants symbolically enact the departure of children from the physical world, rehearsing their arrival in a fantastical, eternal space. The emphasis on play, joy, and creative imagination as hallmarks of this afterlife is striking, and bears a curious resemblance to the fantastical adventures and perpetual childhood depicted in the earliest drafts of Peter Pan. The Society's conceptual vocabulary, words like lost, found, eternal, and flight, echoes with an eerie resonance in Barrie's work, suggesting that he may have absorbed, consciously or subconsciously, some of these thematic elements circulating within the cultural ether of his time. The Neverland Society was more than a literary curiosity. It operated as a microcosmic community with its own internal hierarchies, rituals, and codes of conduct. Adults who were members often assumed the role of guardians, guides, or mentors, responsible for maintaining the sanctity of the children's liminal status and ensuring the proper execution of ceremonies. In some reports, adherents would stage elaborate tableaus in which children were elevated through symbolic acts of play or flight, culminating in the reenactment of their entrance into the immortalized island. These practices were designed to reinforce both the philosophical and emotional commitments of the participants, creating a ritual economy in which grief, desire, and imagination were systematically engaged. The parallels with Barrie's personal behavior, particularly his intense involvement with the Llewellyn Davies boys, are difficult to ignore. The intricate interplay of guidance, supervision, and imaginative co-creation within Neverland mirrors the organizational and psychological patterns that the Neverland Society appears to have cultivated in real life. Symbolism was central to the Society's practice, and its language functioned as both metaphor and operational guide. Flight, beyond its aesthetic charm, was a literal and symbolic representation of transcendence, a physical enactment of the soul's liberation from temporal bonds. Islands served as repositories of purity, sanctuaries removed from human corruption, and spaces in which the moral and spiritual virtues of childhood could be perpetually cultivated. Youth, moreover, was not merely a stage of physical life but a state of being, a quality to be ritualistically maintained and restored through imaginative enactment and ceremonial observance. In this sense, the Society's worldview was suffused with an almost obsessive attention to order, symbolism, and the ethical codification of innocence. The ritualization of these concepts, through narrative, performance, and symbolic action, created a cognitive environment in which the eternal child became a central point of both spiritual and aesthetic devotion. Barrie's Neverland, in its architecture of adventure, suspended time, and codified hierarchy, can be read as a literary parallel to these ritualistic preoccupations. Moreover, the Society's practices reveal an implicit engagement with the human confrontation with mortality. By framing death as a passage to a joyous, suspended existence, the Neverland Society offered a form of cognitive and emotional mastery over the incomprehensible finality of death, particularly for the young. Its adherents sought to ritualize the uncertainty of life, constructing symbolic pathways through which the transition from corporeal existence to eternal play could be safely imagined and socially mediated. Barrie's work mirrors this dynamic. In Neverland, children face dangers, confront adversaries, and engage with mortality symbolically, yet they are ultimately preserved from its absolute consequences. The narrative, therefore, functions as both fantasy and psychological rehearsal, allowing readers and participants to navigate the tension between life and death, peril and safety, through the medium of imaginative play. The conceptual alignment between the Society's ritual aims and Barrie's narrative strategy underscores the plausibility of a connection, whether direct or diffused through cultural currents. The Society's fragmentary textual remains also suggest that it operated within a broader network of occult and spiritualist thought. During the late 19th century, London was a hub of esoteric experimentation, where secret societies, mystical circles, and spiritualist congregations flourished. Ideas about the persistence of the soul, the sanctity of innocence, and the symbolic power of ritual were widely circulated among these groups. The Neverland Society appears to have synthesized these themes, producing a tightly focused, child-centric doctrine that both reflected and intensified contemporary anxieties and desires. It is within this matrix that Barrie's early drafts of Peter Pan can be contextualized. The story emerges not merely from private imagination, but from a cultural environment saturated with symbolic, ritualistic, and philosophical engagements with youth, mortality, and transcendence. The interplay between personal trauma, cultural milieu, and esoteric ideology is thus central to understanding the darker undercurrents of his work. Finally, the Neverland Society illuminates the ways in which fiction and ritual may mutually inform one another. By codifying the eternal child, the Society created a vocabulary, a set of narrative strategies, and a symbolic grammar that could be, and perhaps was, absorbed into the imaginative practices of contemporary writers. Barrie's depiction of flight, the organization of the Lost Boys, the sanctity of Neverland's Island, and the elevation of play to a moral and existential principle all resonate with the Society's known or reconstructed practices. While no direct evidence confirms that Barrie ever interacted with or studied the Society, the thematic congruence suggests at minimum a diffusion of ideas through the cultural and psychological networks of the time. Neverland, then, can be understood as both a literary and ritualistic landscape, a domain in which the human longing for immortality, innocence, and transcendence is made tangible, structured, and narratively realized. The motif of flight, long celebrated in myth and folklore, assumes a distinct and profound significance within both the doctrines of the Neverland Society and the imaginative landscape of J.M. Barrie's fiction. In the late Victorian and Edwardian imagination, flight was more than physical movement. It was a potent symbol of transcendence, liberation, and passage from the constraints of mortal life. Within the esoteric practices of the Neverland Society, flight represented the soul's ascent from corporeal existence to a realm where temporal and moral limitations no longer applied. Rituals designed to evoke or simulate flight often involved imaginative enactments, symbolic gestures, and narrative exercises in which children were elevated, either literally through ceremony or metaphorically through storytelling, into a state of eternal play. This act of rising, both playful and solemn, encapsulated the Society's fundamental belief that childhood, purified through ritual and imagination, could be preserved beyond the bounds of earthly mortality. Flight was thus not a mere fantasy, but a structured expression of hope, grief, and spiritual aspiration, bridging the gap between life and the afterlife in ways that were psychologically compelling and culturally resonant. Barrie's Peter Pan embodies this symbolic flight with uncanny precision. The boy who never grows up does not merely move through space. He traverses boundaries between life, play, and mortality, carrying with him the implicit promise of escape from the finite, constrained world of adults. Each ascent, whether across the rooftops of London or above the fantastical landscapes of Neverland, functions as a metaphorical passage akin to the spiritualist conception of the soul's liberation. Edwardian spiritualism, which permeated literature, parlor culture, and the broader social imagination, frequently depicted ascending children or spirit intermediaries as conduits between the living and the dead, bridging human consciousness with the ineffable mysteries beyond. Peter's flight, while celebrated as a playful act of adventure, echoes these notions of ascent and spiritual passage, suggesting that Barrie's narrative imagination was deeply entwined with contemporary cultural understandings of death, transcendence, and childhood purity. The popular fascination with child mediums and spirit children during this era further reinforces the symbolic resonance of flight. Across London and other urban centres, spiritualist practitioners claim to communicate with deceased children, often emphasizing the purity, insight, and otherworldly knowledge of these youthful spirits. Public séances, journal accounts, and anecdotal testimonies repeatedly depicted child spirits as possessing a luminous quality, an innocence untainted by earthly corruption, capable of offering guidance, comfort, or revelation to the living. Within this cultural framework, the act of ascending, whether imagined, ritualized, or narrated, was inseparable from the preservation of childhood as a sacred state. Barrie's literary flights echo these beliefs in subtle yet persistent ways. Peter Pan's ability to rise above the material world, to traverse impossible distances, and to return unscathed reflects a culturally mediated understanding of children as liminal figures, capable of bridging worlds and embodying both vitality and transcendence. Moreover, the interplay of ritual, imagination, and flight in both the Neverland Society and Barrie's narrative underscores a broader psychological function, the management of grief and mortality. Flight functions as a form of symbolic control over death, offering a mechanism through which the anxieties and sorrows associated with loss can be transformed into structured, imaginative practice. For members of the society, this ritual elevation of children provided solace, a tangible sense that the departed were preserved, celebrated, and integrated into a larger, eternal order. In Barrie's fiction, Peter's flights perform a similar function. They convert the terror of mortality into narrative empowerment, allowing characters, and by extension readers, to navigate danger and the spectre of death with agency, creativity, and imaginative resilience. The literary and ritualistic functions of flight thus converge, revealing a cultural and psychological strategy in which the imagination mediates the ultimate unknowable, the transition from life to whatever lies beyond. The symbolism of flight also intersects with the geographic and spatial motifs of Neverland. Islands, clouds, and distant horizons function as both physical and metaphysical markers of the afterlife, spaces removed from human corruption and temporal limitation. In the Neverland Society's practice, islands were envisioned as sanctuaries for child spirits, isolated realms where play and ritual could continue uninterrupted by the imperatives of mortality. Barrie's depiction of Neverland mirrors this structure. The island exists outside conventional geography, suspended in time, and populated by beings whose lives are dictated by rules of adventure and moral imagination, rather than the inexorable passage of age and decay. Flight, in this sense, is the connective tissue between the familiar and the eternal, allowing Peter Pan and his companions to access spaces that are simultaneously playful and sacred, earthly and otherworldly. The act of rising, then, is both literal and symbolic, a bridge linking corporeal experience with metaphysical aspiration. Edwardian popular culture, suffused with fascination for the supernatural, the afterlife, and the preservation of childhood, provided fertile ground for the dissemination of these symbolic motifs. Children were routinely celebrated as moral exemplars and spiritual intermediaries, their lives and deaths imbued with heightened significance. The widespread belief in spirit children contributed to a cultural environment in which flight, suspended time, and the eternal preservation of youth could be imaginatively explored without moral censure. In this milieu, Barrie's work resonates not merely as literary fantasy, but as a cultural artifact, synthesizing social anxieties, spiritualist beliefs, and personal grief into a narrative that renders both loss and transcendence comprehensible, aesthetically engaging, and emotionally resonant. The metaphorical weight of flight in Barrie's narrative is further amplified by its association with agency and liberation. Whereas children in Victorian London were largely constrained by social, economic, and moral structures, Peter's ability to fly symbolizes emancipation from these limitations. In the context of the Neverland Society, the act of symbolic ascent similarly conferred a form of spiritual agency. Child spirits, once elevated through ritual and imagination, could occupy a domain in which their purity and vitality were protected from earthly corruption. Barrie's flights, therefore, can be read as literary enactments of this broader cultural aspiration, the transformation of vulnerability into autonomy, mortality into transcendence, and grief into imaginative empowerment. The alignment of narrative and ritual underscores the plausibility that Barrie's work absorbed motifs circulating within spiritualist and cultic circles, translating them into a narrative grammar accessible to a wider public while preserving their symbolic potency. Flight, in its recursive appearances throughout Peter Pan, is never merely mechanical or superficial. It is intertwined with the story's ethical and emotional architecture. The ability to rise above danger, to traverse impossible distances, and to return unscathed functions as both a narrative device and a symbolic statement. It communicates the possibility of survival beyond corporeal limits, the enduring potency of innocence, and the permeability of the boundary between life and afterlife. Similarly, in the practices of the Neverland Society, ascent embodies a promise that death is not absolute, that children, in particular, may be ritually safeguarded, and that imagination, ritual, and symbolic enactment together can mediate the finality of mortality. Barrie's alignment with these motifs, whether conscious or absorbed through cultural osmosis, demonstrates the degree to which his imaginative vision was shaped by contemporary beliefs about childhood, spiritual transcendence, and the capacity of play to negotiate existential anxieties. Finally, the integration of flight as a metaphor across both the society's practices and Barrie's fiction illuminates a fundamental principle: the desire to render human vulnerability, grief, and mortality into an imaginative and ritualized experience. In the absence of empirical control over death, symbolic flight offers a structured form of mastery, allowing the human mind to visualize and navigate the otherwise unknowable. Barrie's narrative, in its repeated aerial journeys, captures the essence of this process, transforming anxiety into wonder, peril into opportunity, and mortality into a scaffold for imagination. The persistent echoes of spiritualist practice, child medium beliefs, and the ritualized doctrines of the Neverland Society in his work suggest that Peter Pan's flights are neither accidental nor purely fantastical. They are expressions of culturally mediated strategies for confronting death, preserving innocence, and sustaining the human imagination in the face of existential finality. In this light, Neverland emerges not merely as a playground of whimsy, but as a liminal space in which the promise of the afterlife, the preservation of youth, and the transcendence of earthly constraint are rendered both tangible and narratively compelling. At first glance, Neverland presents itself as a place of whimsy, adventure, and unending childhood delight. Yet beneath this playful exterior lies a complex and persistent engagement with death. J.M. Barrie's narrative is suffused with motifs that, when closely examined, reveal an intricate symbolic system in which mortality, danger, and ritualized transformation are ever present. The premise of never growing up, ostensibly an idealized escape from adult responsibility, functions simultaneously as a subtle engagement with the human preoccupation with death. Peter Pan's refusal to age, his cyclical adventures, and the perpetual return of conflicts within Neverland suggest that life in this realm is not merely eternal in innocence, but suspended in a liminal state between vitality and mortality, a symbolic allegory of death itself. This interpretive lens allows the narrative to be read as a meditation on the inevitability of death, the anxiety surrounding its approach, and the imaginative strategies through which humans seek to negotiate its inevitability. Central to this reading is the understanding that Neverland operates as a space in which death is both present and deferred, enacted and sublimated. The violent duels between Peter and Captain Hook, the constant threats from wild animals, and the repeated confrontations with pirates all mirror the persistent intrusion of mortality into childhood. Yet, these dangers are never fatal in the conventional sense. Injuries are fleeting, threats are survivable, and characters return, often unchanged, to the cycle of play. This cyclical resurrection mirrors the ritualistic practices documented in accounts of the Neverland Society, wherein ceremonial enactments symbolically represented death and the soul's subsequent renewal or ascent. In both contexts, death is structured, mediated, and transformed into a narrative or ritual sequence that allows participants, whether fictional characters, readers, or cult initiates, to engage with the notion of mortality in a controlled, imaginative, and psychologically manageable way. The allegory of death in Neverland thus functions as both an existential meditation and a continuation of broader esoteric and spiritualist preoccupations with transition, preservation, and eternal recurrence. The characters themselves embody specific archetypes that reinforce this allegorical reading. Peter Pan, for instance, functions as a psychopomp, a mediator between life and death, play and permanence. He shepherds the lost boys through adventures that mirror symbolic rites of passage, confronting danger while maintaining the pretense of immunity from mortality. His flight, mischievousness, and detachment from adult responsibility under his liminal role. He is simultaneously alive and symbolically unbound by temporal constraints, a guide through a realm in which the conventional rules of existence are suspended. In this role, Peter mirrors the conceptual functions of child spirits in spiritualist practice, intermediaries who mediate between the living and the dead, whose innocence and vitality grant them a special position within a cosmology that seeks to reconcile mortality with continuity. Tinker Bell, too, assumes a symbolic role that transcends her apparent function as a comic or supportive companion. She can be interpreted as a spirit familiar, an ethereal presence whose loyalty, vigilance, and occasional capriciousness embody the qualities of a guiding spirit within ritual and allegorical frameworks. In the context of the Neverland Society, spirits or symbolic companions were often invoked to facilitate transitions, maintain the sanctity of ritualized play, and embody the liminal qualities of childhood itself. Tinker Bell's constant accompaniment to Peter, her ability to influence events indirectly, and her tenuous existence at the boundary of the material and fantastical worlds position her as an allegorical agent, a supernatural adjunct that reinforces the narrative's exploration of life, death, and the preservation of innocence. Her presence underscores the interplay of companionship, guardianship, and liminality that defines the symbolic ecosystem of Neverland. Captain Hook, in contrast, represents the figure of Thanatos, the embodiment of death, danger, and temporal limitation. His obsession with Peter, his physical vulnerability, and the perpetual threat he poses constitute the inescapable presence of mortality and entropy within the Neverland landscape. Unlike Peter, Hook is bound by conventional temporality, aging, and corporeal limitation. He cannot ascend, fly, or evade the consequences of his existence. Within the allegorical frame, he functions as both antagonist and teacher, reminding both characters and readers of the inescapable interplay between life and death. His recurrent defeats, injuries, and ultimate evasion of narrative finality mirror the ritualized confrontations with mortality found in cultic practices. Danger is enacted, confronted, and symbolically neutralized, but its existential significance remains present and persistent. Hook embodies the tension between the desire for eternal childhood and the inevitability of death, a figure whose narrative purpose is inseparable from the story's exploration of mortality and symbolic resurrection. The narrative structure of Neverland itself reinforces these allegorical themes through cyclical repetition and ritualized events. Battles, rescues, adventures, and flights recur across the story, creating a temporal rhythm that mirrors the patterns of ritual enactment found in esoteric societies. The repetition of challenge, confrontation, and symbolic triumph functions as a rehearsal for the confrontation with mortality, allowing both characters and readers to engage with life and death dynamics within the controlled environment of narrative play. Such structural repetition reflects the psychological and cultural function of ritual. The predictable sequence of events provides a framework within which participants can negotiate fear, hope, and the ethical dimensions of existence. Barrie's story, through its cycles of conflict and renewal, transforms mortality into a comprehensible, almost aesthetic phenomenon, echoing the ceremonial strategies of the Neverland Society in which death, ascent, and eternal play were carefully codified and enacted. Further symbolic layers emerge when considering the interactions between the lost boys themselves. Their collective adventures, loyalty to Peter, and participation in simulated duels exemplify a miniature social ecology in which death and survival are constantly negotiated. These dynamics mirror the social and ritualistic structures observed in the Neverland Society, where children's imaginative participation in ceremonial enactments of death, transition, and ascension reinforced communal bonds, moral hierarchy, and the sanctity of innocence. The Lost Boys' playful confrontations, while entertaining, carry the subtext of ritual preparation. Each challenge, skirmish, or flight functions as a rehearsal for symbolic encounters with mortality, embedding within the narrative a subtle pedagogy that prepares participants psychologically to comprehend the cycles of life, death, and renewal. Beyond the characters and structure, Barrie's imagery provides further evidence of death's pervasive symbolic presence. The depiction of the Neverwood, pirate ships, and other liminal spaces conveys a persistent tension between danger and sanctuary, mortality and preservation. Shadows, hidden threats, and mysterious disappearances permeate the landscape, creating a topography in which life and death coexist as intertwined phenomena. These elements evoke the esoteric and allegorical iconography of Victorian occultism, wherein forests, islands, and isolated realms were often employed as symbolic sites of initiation, transformation, and confrontation with mortality. Barrie's landscapes, therefore, are not merely whimsical backdrops but carefully constructed symbolic environments that echo the ritual and imaginative strategies of contemporary esoteric societies, including the alleged Neverland cult. Within these spaces, the cycles of death, threat, and renewal are enacted, ensuring that the narrative operates simultaneously on the levels of adventure, psychological rehearsal, and allegorical meditation. The concept of resurrection, repeatedly implied throughout the story, reinforces this allegorical reading. Characters are constantly subjected to trials, injuries, or near-perilous encounters, yet emerge renewed, unscathed, or enriched by experience. This pattern mirrors ritual reenactments of death and rebirth documented in accounts of the Neverland Society, in which participants symbolically enacted passage from corporeal vulnerability to a state of eternal play or transcendence. The narrative's insistence on cyclical renewal ensures that death remains present as a conceptual and symbolic force, while simultaneously permitting the suspension of its finality. In this way, Neverland functions as both imaginative playground and moral psychological laboratory, a realm in which the ethical, emotional, and existential consequences of mortality are explored in a controlled and symbolic form. Even the interplay of magic, flight, and enchantment contributes to this symbolic architecture. Peter's ability to rise above danger, navigate peril, and maintain autonomy reflects not only imaginative fantasy, but also a coded engagement with the human desire to mediate mortality, preserve innocence, and enact transcendence. Flight, as explored in the preceding section, is inseparable from the narrative's exploration of death. It functions as both literal action and metaphorical ascent, a ritualized gesture that transforms vulnerability into mastery, danger into possibility, and mortality into narrative scaffold. The synergy between ritual, symbolism, and imaginative play imbues Neverland with a depth that exceeds its apparent whimsy, situating Barrie's work within a continuum of esoteric, spiritualist, and psychological preoccupations with mortality, childhood, and transcendence. Ultimately, reading Peter Pan as an allegory of death reveals the profound interplay between narrative, ritual, and symbolic thought. Peter as Psychopomp, Tinker Bell as Spirit Familiar, Hook as Thanatos, and the recurring cycles of adventure, peril, and renewal collectively construct a symbolic ecosystem in which mortality is omnipresent yet mediated, enacted yet sublimated, threatening yet aestheticized. The story's imaginative strategies echo the ritualized practices of the Neverland Society, translating ceremonial enactments of death and rebirth into narrative forms accessible to a wider audience while preserving their psychological and symbolic potency. Barrie's Neverland, in this interpretive frame, becomes a space in which human anxiety about mortality, desire for eternal childhood, and fascination with ritualized transcendence converge, producing a literary landscape in which death is ever present but transformed through play, imagination, and structured repetition into something both comprehensible and compelling. The Llewellyn-Davies family occupies a uniquely tragic place in the history of J.M. Barrie's life and in the broader cultural narrative that underlies Neverland. George and Sylvia Llewellyn-Davies, wealthy yet beset by personal and familial difficulties, became unwitting architects of a story that would blend imagination, grief, and the perilous allure of eternal childhood. The 5 boys, George, Jack, Peter, Michael, and Nico, were drawn into Barrie's orbit following Sylvia's widowhood, and it was under his tutelage, companionship, and creative influence that they became the living inspiration for the Lost Boys. From the outset, their lives were entwined with the author's vision. The children were treated with a combination of affection, theatrical indulgence, and structured imaginative play that mirrored the patterns of Neverland. Barrie's intense involvement, though motivated by personal attachment and grief over his own lost brother, created a framework in which fantasy and reality were inseparable, and in which the lines between play, ritual, and psychological influence became remarkably blurred. The deaths of the parents, particularly that of Sylvia in 1910, intensified both Barrie's protective role and the boy's entrenchment within a world of symbolic childhood. Barrie assumed a paternal role, providing stability, imaginative guidance, and emotional oversight. Yet within this protective enclosure, the boys were immersed in a narrative that elevated eternal youth and the suspension of temporal realities. Play was no longer merely recreational. It was infused with moral and existential significance, rehearsing themes of survival, confrontation, and transcendence. In this context, the children's daily lives mirrored the ritualized enactments of the Neverland society. Fantasy, moral instruction, and symbolic confrontation with mortality coalesced in a sustained, performative engagement with the ideas of death, eternal childhood, and symbolic immortality. Barrie's literary creations were not simply inspired by the boys. They were enacted through their participation, creating a psychological ecosystem in which imaginative engagement was inseparable from emotional dependence and the cultivation of symbolic roles. The psychological implications of this dynamic are complex. Scholars and biographers have debated the extent to which Barrie's influence may have romanticized the dangers of eternal youth, imbuing the boy's formative years with a preoccupation with mortality, risk, and imaginative suspension. The imaginative framework he provided, while protective in some respects, may have inadvertently cultivated a persistent tension between the allure of immortality and the inescapable realities of mortality. The narrative structures of Neverland, endless cycles of adventure, confrontations with danger, and recurring resurrections, paralleled, perhaps too closely, the emotional and symbolic architecture of the boys' real lives. In a sense, the children were participants in a lived allegory, in which play rehearsed existential themes and imagination mediated grief, loss, and the unknowable future. The psychological stakes were substantial, for the boys were navigating both the ordinary vicissitudes of adolescence and the extraordinary intensity of their symbolic roles within Barrie's literary universe. The later tragedies of the Llewellyn-Davies brothers, most notably the suicides of George and Michael, have fueled speculation about the psychological pressures inherent in this prolonged engagement with fantasy, mortality, and symbolic identity. While causality is impossible to establish with certainty, the alignment between their lives and the motifs of Neverland is striking. The sustained immersion in a narrative world that elevated eternal youth and ritualized encounters with danger may have contributed to a complex emotional landscape in which death, loss, and transcendence were both compelling and hauntingly present. Barrie's protective, imaginative guidance, though well-intentioned, may have amplified the psychological intensity of these symbolic patterns, creating conditions in which the boundaries between life, death, and fantasy became perilously porous. Beyond the personal tragedies of the Llewellyn-Davies family, the circumstances of their lives raise broader questions about the influence of cultural and symbolic frameworks on vulnerable children. The immersive enactment of narrative, ritual, and imaginative practice mirrors the structures observed in esoteric societies, including the alleged Neverland Society. In both contexts, children participate in highly structured environments in which symbolic action, imaginative engagement, and ritual enactments of mortality provide psychological scaffolding for coping with existential uncertainty. The difference, of course, lies in the voluntary versus imposed nature of participation and in the degree to which external adult guidance mediates the child's experience. Barrie's role combined mentorship, authorship, and imaginative co-creation, producing a hybridized environment in which the boys' experiences of childhood, adventure, and danger were simultaneously real and symbolic. This duality, while culturally resonant and artistically productive, introduced a latent tension. The boys were living embodiments of a narrative that rehearsed both mortality and transcendence, placing them within a complex interplay of love, dependency, and existential rehearsal. The metaphorical resonance of their lives is further reinforced when considering the persistent motifs of disappearance, absence, and symbolic transformation within Neverland. Just as Peter Pan and the Lost Boys inhabit a realm in which mortality is deferred yet symbolically enacted, the Llewellyn-Davies boys existed within a psychological and imaginative space in which their identities were continuously negotiated between fantasy and reality. The interplay of loss and survival, danger and invulnerability, mirrors the cycles of peril and renewal central to Barrie's narrative. The children's lived experiences, therefore, can be read as a parallel to the literary enactments of Neverland, in which adventure and existential rehearsal coexist, and in which the symbolic engagement with death is both protective and psychologically intense. Their childhoods, heavily mediated by Barrie's vision, were not merely formative. They were ritualized, narrative-infused, and suffused with symbolic significance. The question naturally arises: to what extent were the boys drawn into a psychological or symbolic cult of Neverland? While the term cult must be applied with caution, the structural and symbolic parallels are difficult to ignore. Barrie's prolonged influence, the immersion in imaginative enactments, the elevation of eternal youth as a central value, and the pervasive presence of mortality as narrative and symbolic motif collectively suggest a form of ritualized engagement. The boys were participants in a framework that echoed the objectives of the Neverland Society, in which imagination, symbolic play, and ritualized encounters with death mediated the transition from vulnerability to mastery. In this sense, Neverland was not simply a literary creation but a psychological and symbolic environment in which the boys' experiences were guided, structured, and intensively mediated by the adult architect of the narrative. The alignment of the Llewellyn-Davies family's lived experience with the thematic and symbolic concerns of Barrie's work underscores the broader cultural and existential questions embedded within Neverland. The narrative's appeal, both to Barrie and to contemporary audiences, lies in its ability to synthesize the pleasures of play with the profound anxieties of mortality, vulnerability, and loss. For the boys themselves, the narrative was inseparable from their lived reality. They inhabited a space in which imagination mediated experience, narrative rehearsed existential threats, and symbolic roles provided both guidance and psychological intensity. The tragic outcomes of their lives do not invalidate the aesthetic or cultural significance of Barrie's creation, but they illuminate the latent risks inherent in prolonged engagement with symbolic and ritualized frameworks, particularly for children whose psychological and emotional capacities are still developing. Finally, the Llewellyn-Davies mystery compels a reconsideration of the broader implications of Barrie's work. Neverland, in its literary form, offers a vision of suspended childhood, adventure, and imaginative transcendence. In its lived enactment through the lives of the boys, it demonstrates the power and potential peril of symbolic immersion, ritualized play, and adult-mediated fantasy. The interweaving of grief, imagination, and existential rehearsal creates a complex dynamic, one in which the boundaries between life and narrative, reality and ritual, innocence and mortality, are deliberately and persistently porous. By examining the tragic fate of the Llewellyn-Davies brothers alongside the symbolic structures of Neverland, it becomes possible to see the narrative not merely as a whimsical tale, but as an active engagement with the cultural, psychological, and esoteric preoccupations of Edwardian society. The desire to preserve childhood, the fascination with death, and the ongoing negotiation between the finite human lifespan and the imaginative promise of eternity. The theme of forgetting occupies a central and paradoxical place within Peter Pan, functioning as both narrative device and psychological mechanism. In Neverland, memory is fluid, past traumas are deferred, absent figures are rendered invisible, and the relentless repetition of play erases the linear consequences of experience. This narrative amnesia is not merely a literary convenience. It mirrors the symbolic and ritualized practices observed in esoteric societies such as the alleged Neverland Society, in which forgetting served as a form of purification, a deliberate severing of attachments to the pain and impermanence of mortal existence. Through the perpetual erasure of memory, childhood is preserved, grief is suspended, and the inhabitants of Neverland are able to engage continuously with a world in which loss, danger, and mortality are both acknowledged and simultaneously neutralized. Forgetting, therefore, emerges as a central mechanism for reconciling the psychological imperatives of mourning, anxiety, and existential uncertainty with the imaginative promise of immortality and perpetual innocence. Within Barrie's narrative, forgetting manifests in multiple forms. The lost boys themselves inhabit a state of temporal suspension, their previous identities, familial attachments, and conventional life histories obscured by the narrative's insistence on eternal presentness. Peter Pan, as both instigator and observer of this state, actively mediates the erasure of memory. He maintains the illusion of continuity, ensures that play overrides reflection, and subtly enforces the psychological conditions necessary for perpetual engagement with the fantasy of Neverland. This process of selective amnesia mirrors ritual practices in which remembrance and forgetting are carefully balanced to achieve psychological and spiritual objectives. In the case of the Neverland Society, participants were thought to undergo imaginative exercises designed to displace sorrow, fear, and attachment, replacing them with a symbolic rehearsal of eternal youth, play, and transcendence. Forgetting, therefore, is not passive. It is active, structured, and deeply ritualized, functioning as both safeguard and transformative process. The psychological mechanisms at work in this process align closely with contemporary understandings of trauma and mourning. Edwardian society, particularly in urban centers such as London, was characterized by high mortality rates among children and pervasive engagement with grief and loss. Mourning rituals, both public and private, often emphasized structured remembrance, while simultaneously encouraging forms of emotional distancing or denial as a means of coping. In this cultural context, the perpetual erasure of painful memory, whether through imaginative play, ritual, or narrative, was a psychologically coherent strategy for mitigating the intensity of grief. Barrie's narrative replicates this dynamic within the imaginative space of Neverland. Danger is present but transient, injury is experienced but reversible, and the cycles of loss are continuously mediated by play, flight, and renewal. In effect, the story operationalizes a form of psychological rehearsal in which forgetting functions as both protection and liberation, allowing participants to inhabit a world in which mortality and suffering are acknowledged yet rendered non-terminal. The interplay of denial, repetition, and memory suppression is central to the construction of identity within Neverland. Children who arrive on the island are gradually assimilated into its rhythms. Their former lives, familial obligations, and experiences of trauma are rendered distant, both in their consciousness and in the narrative's perspective. This transformation parallels the ritualized processes of symbolic death and rebirth observed in esoteric child-focused societies, in which participants' previous identities were ritually suspended, allowing them to adopt a liminal, morally and spiritually purified status. By forgetting prior suffering and embracing the repetitive cycles of play, the inhabitants of Neverland are effectively reborn into a symbolic ecology in which innocence and vitality are preserved. Forgetting, in this sense, is not an absence but a form of presence. It actively structures experience, reshapes identity, and enables the suspension of mortality's psychological impact. The mechanisms of forgetting in Neverland also resonate with the temporal and spatial structuring of the narrative itself. Time in Neverland is cyclical rather than linear. Days repeat, adventures recur, and conflicts are perpetually renewed. This cyclical temporality functions as a narrative analogue to ritualized forgetting. By preventing linear continuity, the story erases the cumulative effects of trauma and mortality, replacing them with a structured, recurring framework in which the consequences of experience are perpetually mediated. The island itself, as a contained and timeless space, reinforces this dynamic. Geography and temporality work together to support the psychological project of perpetual innocence. Spaces are both familiar and mutable, events are recurrent yet novel, and memory's grip on the present is deliberately softened. Barrie's careful orchestration of time and space ensures that forgetting is both functional and symbolic, sustaining the thematic cohesion of Neverland while reflecting deeper cultural preoccupations with mortality and emotional preservation. This process of forgetting is further intertwined with the narrative's symbolic engagement with death. Whereas the lost boys and other inhabitants of Neverland are shielded from permanent harm, the narrative consistently gestures toward mortality through perilous encounters, injuries, and symbolic confrontations with danger. These events function as controlled reminders of life's fragility, yet the subsequent erasure of memory or the resumption of play ensures that fear, grief, and loss are contained within manageable bounds. In this way, Forgetting operates as both protective mechanism and ritualistic rehearsal, allowing participants to engage with the symbolic dimensions of death without succumbing to its existential finality. Within the alleged practices of the Neverland Society, similar dynamics are evident. Imaginative enactments of death, ritualized repetition, and structured amnesia permitted participants to internalize the moral and spiritual significance of mortality while maintaining the psychological benefits of perpetual innocence. The parallel suggests that Barrie's narrative may have absorbed, consciously or unconsciously, the psychological logic of these cultural practices, translating them into literary form with extraordinary subtlety. Memory suppression also intersects with the cultivation of innocence in profound ways. By erasing the psychological residues of trauma, attachment, and loss, Neverland ensures that its inhabitants are continuously oriented toward play, creativity, and moral experimentation. In essence, forgetting functions as a form of ritual purification. The past is neutralized, pain is temporarily suspended, and the symbolic structures of childhood, friendship, adventure, and imaginative autonomy are preserved in perpetuity. The psychological and symbolic effects are mutually reinforcing. Innocence is maintained through forgetting, and forgetting is rendered meaningful through engagement with the moral, imaginative, and existential rhythms of the island. This intricate interplay reflects the broader cultural context of Edwardian mourning culture, in which grief was ritualized, attachment was mediated, and imaginative exercises were valorized as tools for emotional survival. Finally, the narrative's emphasis on forgetting highlights a central tension in Barrie's work, the balance between protection and psychological intensity. The perpetual suspension of memory safeguards children from the emotional weight of mortality, yet it simultaneously exposes them to prolonged engagement with symbolic danger, imaginative responsibility, and existential rehearsal. The psychological stakes are profound, for the suspension of memory both enables and constrains experience, creating a space in which the imagination mediates grief and mortality in ways that are simultaneously empowering and psychologically complex. In both literary and ritual contexts, forgetting functions as a form of structured liberation, allowing participants to inhabit a space in which the burdens of history, trauma, and temporal limitation are continually suspended, while the ethical, imaginative, and symbolic challenges of life are actively rehearsed. Through this lens, Neverland can be understood as a domain in which the ritual of forgetting, the preservation of innocence, and the mediated engagement with death converge, producing a literary and psychological landscape of exceptional subtlety and emotional resonance. The act of writing, for J.M. Barrie, was never simply an exercise in storytelling. It was a deliberate engagement with memory, loss, and the possibility of transcendence. His creative process can be understood as a form of literary necromancy, a ritualized attempt to reanimate the dead through narrative. In the case of Peter Pan, this phenomenon is particularly evident. The Lost Boys, though ostensibly fictional, bear a striking resemblance to the real-life Llewellyn Davies children, whose lives and eventual tragedies haunted Barrie's imagination. Through the repeated cycles of adventure, peril, and return that characterize his works, Barrie enacts a symbolic resurrection, preserving the vitality, innocence, and presence of these figures within the textual and performative spaces of his plays and novels. Writing becomes a medium through which mortality is suspended, absence is denied, and the energies of lost children are re-embodied, allowing both author and audience to engage with the dead in a structured, emotionally resonant, and imaginative fashion. This act of literary resurrection parallels practices found within the spiritualist movement that flourished in Britain and the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Spiritualist writers and mediums frequently claimed that their texts, poems, or novels were dictated by the deceased, functioning as conduits through which the dead could communicate with the living. Barrie's work, though not explicitly framed as spiritualist, resonates with the logic of this cultural practice. The repeated invocation of absent figures, the careful preservation of childhood identity, and the narrative's insistence on cyclical return mirror the procedures of mediumship, in which the living act as intermediaries, translating spectral presence into textual form. In Peter Pan, the stage becomes a site of collective séance, actors, audience, and text collaborate in reanimating the symbolic lives of children, restoring them to imaginative visibility, and ensuring that their vitality transcends corporeal limitations. The structure of Barrie's narrative reinforces this function of literary resurrection. Characters are repeatedly placed in situations of mortal danger, yet the resolution always enacts a symbolic return to life, a rehearsal of resurrection that mirrors ritualized practices of the deceased. The lost boy's perpetual youth and repeated survival echo the logic of spiritualist mediumship, wherein death is neither final nor absolute but subject to ritual, imagination, and narrative authority. By positioning his characters within an eternal present, Barrie transforms narrative temporality into a mechanism of resurrection. Loss is suspended, mortality is mediated, and the dead are given form and voice within the imaginative ecosystem of the text. This literary mechanism demonstrates the intimate entanglement of mourning, creativity, and ritual, illustrating how storytelling can function as a conduit for both psychological coping and symbolic restoration. The relationship between Barrie and the Llewellyn Davies boys exemplifies the personal and emotional dimensions of this necromantic process. Barrie's prolonged engagement with their lives, through storytelling, imaginative play, and literary creation, enabled him to enact a kind of sustained resurrection, preserving aspects of the children's personalities, energies, and presence within his work. In writing Peter Pan, Barrie not only memorializes the boys but also transforms them into archetypes, embedding them within a symbolic universe in which death is mediated and innocence is immortalized. This transformation mirrors the ritualistic aims of the Neverland Society, in which imaginative and ceremonial practices sought to preserve the vitality of departed children and to enable survivors to interact with them symbolically. In both contexts, the act of creation functions as a negotiation with mortality, converting grief and absence into narrative continuity, symbolic presence, and imaginative immortality. Barrie's work further aligns with the principles of literary necromancy through its formal structures and stylistic devices. Repetition, circularity, and the deliberate suspension of consequence operate as mechanisms of preservation. Narrative elements are continually renewed, characters return from near-perilous situations, and temporal linearity is subordinated to the demands of ritualized memory. In this sense, the play and novel function as performative rites. Each reading or staging enacts the resurrection of characters, reasserting their presence, vitality, and narrative authority. The audience becomes complicit in this process, participating in the symbolic reanimation of figures who, in the real world, may have been lost, absent, or deceased. Barrie's narrative techniques, therefore, serve both aesthetic and necromantic purposes, blending literary artistry with ritualized mediation of absence and loss. The psychological efficacy of this process is intertwined with the cultural preoccupations of Edwardian mourning practices. During Barrie's lifetime, childhood mortality was tragically common, and mourning customs emphasized both remembrance and structured ritual as mechanisms for coping with grief. Within this cultural framework, the imaginative resurrection of absent children provided an emotionally coherent and socially resonant means of negotiating the tension between presence and absence, loss and continuity. Barrie's literary necromancy operates within this cultural logic. By embedding the energies, identities, and presences of lost or vulnerable children into textual and performative forms, he engages with the social and psychological imperatives of mourning while simultaneously crafting a compelling and enduring narrative universe. Neverland, in this light, becomes a space in which grief, creativity, and ritual converge, producing both aesthetic satisfaction and emotional consolation. The interplay of character archetypes further reinforces the necromantic function of Barrie's work. Peter Pan, as the eternal boy, embodies both vitality and liminality, mediating between life and death, play and permanence. Tinker Bell functions as a spirit companion, a guide and guardian whose presence is ethereal yet emotionally potent. Captain Hook represents the inescapable shadow of mortality, a figure whose recurrent threats remind both characters and audience of the existential stakes underlying the narrative. The cycles of confrontation, peril, and return echo the structural patterns of ritualized mediumship, in which recurring gestures, symbols, and enactments facilitate communication with and restoration of the dead. Barrie's narrative, in transforming these archetypes into dynamic agents of imaginative resurrection, underscores the extent to which writing itself can function as a form of ceremonial necromancy. The text serves as both conduit and altar, enabling engagement with figures who are absent yet eternally present. Moreover, Barrie's literary necromancy is intertwined with the aesthetic and imaginative pleasures of the narrative. The playful, adventurous surface of Peter Pan conceals the profound emotional and symbolic work performed beneath it, the negotiation of grief, the rehearsal of mortality, and the reanimation of lost figures. Each flight, each rescue, each recurring adventure functions as both narrative excitement and ritualized affirmation of life, presence, and continuity. In this sense, the work operates on multiple levels simultaneously, offering aesthetic enjoyment while enacting the symbolic resurrection of those who, in the material world, may be inaccessible, absent, or lost. The duality of pleasure and ritual underscores the sophistication of Barrie's creative project, blending imaginative artistry with profound psychological and symbolic intention. The comparison with spiritualist writers further illuminates Barrie's methods. Mediums and authors of the period often claimed that their texts were dictated by the dead, functioning as channels through which the absent could speak, act, and influence the living. Barrie's work, though not explicitly framed as channeling, resonates with this logic. The persistent vitality of the lost boys, the recurrence of peril and return, and the narrative's mediation between life, death, and immortality parallel the aims of literary mediumship. In this light, Peter Pan can be read as a disguised séance, in which narrative, character, and audience collaborate to restore lost figures to presence, reassert their energies, and negotiate the anxieties surrounding mortality and absence. Writing, performance, and imagination converge in a ritualistic matrix that both conceals and performs necromancy, transforming grief into narrative energy and absence into imaginative presence. Finally, Barrie's literary necromancy underscores a fundamental human impulse, the desire to transcend mortality, preserve innocence, and assert presence beyond the limits of the corporeal. Through narrative, imaginative play, and ritualized performance, he achieves a mediated form of resurrection, creating a world in which lost children, absent figures, and vulnerable lives can be reanimated and sustained. Peter Pan, in this context, is more than a literary work. It is a sophisticated ritual, a psychological mechanism, and a cultural artifact that enacts the symbolic restoration of life, vitality, and innocence. The interplay of grief, imagination, and literary creation transforms absence into presence, death into ritual, and narrative into a vehicle of resurrection, revealing the profound necromantic potential inherent in the act of writing itself. The corpus of Barrie's work is surrounded not only by published plays and novels, but also by a shadowy network of lost drafts, letters, and marginalia that hint at a far more esoteric engagement with the mystical and the forbidden. Among these documents, scholars have identified correspondences suggesting Barrie's contact with spiritualist and occult circles in London and Edinburgh. While many of these letters are fragmentary or heavily redacted, the surviving content hints at conversations regarding child mediums, the ritualization of play, and esoteric interpretations of youth and death. Barrie's handwriting, sometimes interspersed with drawings or cryptic symbols, evokes a private lexicon in which imagination, mourning, and ritual intertwine, suggesting that his literary creations were inseparable from an ongoing engagement with hidden doctrines that extended beyond the literary sphere. The documents themselves, carefully preserved yet often inaccessible, contribute to the enduring mystique of the Neverland death cult, framing Barrie not merely as a literary figure, but as an intermediary between imaginative and occult worlds. Early manuscripts of Peter Pan further illuminate this connection. Versions of scenes later excised or rewritten contain references to ceremonial enactments, ritual flights, and language evocative of initiation. In some drafts, the lost boys are described using terminology reminiscent of Victorian spiritualist accounts of child mediums. They are channels of vitality, conduits through which energies beyond ordinary life are expressed. Even the depiction of Neverland itself shifts in these manuscripts from a purely fantastical island to a space imbued with liminality, thresholds, and ritual significance. The act of flying, the recurrent duels, and the recurring cycles of danger and renewal acquire the quality of ceremonial performance, echoing the practices documented in contemporary esoteric societies and the alleged Neverland cult. These drafts, now partially suppressed or hidden in private archives, suggest that Barrie's vision of Neverland may have originated in part from a conscious or unconscious synthesis of literary, spiritualist, and occultist impulses. The letters and diaries associated with Barrie's acquaintances reinforce this interpretation. Several surviving accounts from Edwardian contemporaries mention his fascination with séances, spirit writing, and small esoteric gatherings involving children. While some references are ambiguous or anecdotal, there is repeated emphasis on Barrie's interest in mediating between life and death, particularly through the agency of children. In one letter, an acquaintance recounts observing Barrie instructing the Llewellyn Davies boys to call upon unseen guides during imaginative play, a phrase that, while seemingly whimsical, resonates uncannily with the language of ritual invocation. Such documentation, when taken alongside the early manuscripts and suppressed newspaper references, suggests a coherent pattern. Barrie's creative and social life was suffused with the imagery, practices, and psychological dynamics associated with esoteric exploration and ceremonial engagement with the dead. Newspaper articles from the period provide another layer of intrigue. Accounts, some of which were subsequently retracted or disappeared from public record, describe Neverland rituals in London, often associated with small gatherings of children, symbolic enactments of adventure, and mysterious adult oversight. While the veracity of these reports remains contested, the fact that they were deemed controversial enough to suppress indicates that contemporaries recognized the unusual combination of imaginative play, ritual structure, and symbolic engagement with mortality. These suppressed accounts, together with Barrie's personal documents, create a historiographical liminality, blurring the line between fiction, rumor, and occult history. They suggest a world in which imaginative literature, esoteric practice, and social observation intersected in ways that were at once culturally fascinating and socially disquieting. Testimonies from family members and private acquaintances add further texture to this shadow history. Some recall Barrie maintaining secretive notebooks in which he catalogued dream sequences, imagined rites, and interactions with the boys that were never intended for public consumption. Others note his use of coded language, ritualized gestures, and repeated symbolic motifs in correspondence, hinting at a personal mythology that fused literary creation with spiritualist experimentation. These accounts, whether fully accurate or partially colored by the passage of time and the mythologizing of Barrie's life, reinforce the sense that the author operated within a liminal zone, part artist, part ritual practitioner, part chronicler of symbolic experience. The intersection of these roles suggests that Peter Pan and associated narratives functioned not only as entertainment but also as a medium for psychological and symbolic exploration, and perhaps for the subtle enactment of ceremonial ideas regarding death, youth, and transcendence. The nature of these texts, their secrecy, fragmentation, and partial suppression, also speaks to cultural anxieties surrounding the boundaries of childhood, mortality, and adult mediation. Edwardian society was simultaneously fascinated by and fearful of children's vulnerability, spiritualist exploration, and ritualized engagement with death. Barrie's hidden drafts and letters, circulating only within restricted circles, reflect an awareness of these cultural tensions. By encoding esoteric ideas within narrative, personal correspondence, and private journals, Barrie could explore the psychological and symbolic dimensions of mortality, ritual, and childhood without incurring the full weight of societal scrutiny. The text's liminality, existing between public literature and private occult practice, creates an aura of forbidden knowledge, emphasizing both the imaginative depth and the potential moral or cultural risk embedded in Barrie's work. Importantly, the blending of literary and occult practices in these documents illuminates the interplay between narrative, ritual, and memory. Writing, as Barrie engaged with it, functions simultaneously as a creative act and a ritualized performance. Manuscripts and letters preserve absent energies, facilitate symbolic resurrection, and construct temporal spaces in which the dead, the imagined, and the living coexist. The suppressed accounts of Neverland rituals, the cryptic marginalia, and the altered early drafts all contribute to a sense of textual necromancy, reinforcing the idea that the literary work itself is an active agent in the mediation of presence and absence. Whether or not one accepts the literal existence of a death cult, the psychological and symbolic mechanisms documented in these materials suggest that Barrie's creative practice functioned analogously, producing a literary and emotional environment in which lost children could be restored to imaginative life, and death itself could be rehearsed, mediated, and symbolically negotiated. The convergence of letters, drafts, and suppressed testimonies ultimately serves to blur the boundary between literary fiction and historical reality. Barrie's manuscripts and private correspondence are at once documents of creative process and potential artifacts of esoteric engagement. Suppressed newspapers and anecdotal reports suggest a public awareness of practices that mirrored, ritualized, or extended the themes explored in Peter Pan. This interplay between textual evidence, personal documentation, and social observation constructs a historiographical and psychological liminality. Neverland emerges not merely as a literary space, but as a contested zone of imagination, ritual, and historical speculation. The persistence of these materials, albeit partially hidden, fragmentary, or apocryphal, ensures that the myth of the Neverland death cult retains a compelling, ambiguous vitality, operating at the intersection of literature, history, and the occult. Ultimately, the forbidden texts reveal a layered and intricate portrait of Barrie as both author and ritualist. Manuscripts, letters, and testimonies suggest that his creative practice was inseparable from an engagement with ritual, symbolic resurrection, and the mediation of absence. The boundaries between literary invention, esoteric experimentation, and historical circumstance are deliberately porous, producing a narrative and archival landscape in which fiction, memory, and occult speculation converge. These materials, whether authentic or partially legendary, under the depth and intensity of Barrie's imaginative universe, revealing a writer who was, in a very real sense, practicing literary necromancy, writing not merely to entertain, but to restore, preserve, and sustain the presence of the lost, the absent, and the imaginatively immortal. The cultural afterlife of Peter Pan is a study in transformation, adaptation, and selective forgetting, a process as intricate and ritualized as the thematic underpinnings of Barrie's original narrative. The story, which began as a psychologically complex and at times morbid allegory, evolved over the 20th century into a sanitized emblem of childhood innocence, moral playfulness, and nostalgic adventure. Yet beneath the cheerful veneer of modern adaptations, traces of Barrie's darker preoccupations, death, eternal youth, and the psychological intensity of imaginative immersion, persist in subtle, often unacknowledged ways. The evolution of the myth reveals not only changing tastes and cultural sensibilities, but also the persistent power of the story's symbolic and esoteric structures, which continue to resonate even when consciously stripped of their more unsettling dimensions. Following the initial theatrical productions and publications, Barrie's contemporaries and early 20th century audiences recognized the story's dual character, part fantastical adventure, part profound meditation on mortality and loss. Critics at the time noted the recurring motifs of danger, death, and symbolic immortality embedded within the narrative, although public discourse often emphasized the playful and whimsical aspects. After World War I, a period of cultural recalibration in which society sought comfort, stability, and moral reassurance, Peter Pan increasingly came to be understood as a story for children, rather than as a psychologically and esoterically charged allegory. Publishers and theater producers favored versions that emphasized innocence, bravery, and playful escapades while downplaying, or eliminating entirely, the more macabre, liminal, and ritualistic elements present in early drafts and manuscripts. The process of adaptation was itself a form of cultural forgetting, mirroring the psychological and ritualized erasure explored within Barrie's work. Difficult, unsettling material was selectively excised, leaving a narrative that could be safely consumed by a broader, more morally conscious audience. Disney's 1953 animated adaptation exemplifies this trend. The film transforms Neverland into a vivid, brightly colored playground, complete with cheerful pirates, dancing mermaids, and a heroically mischievous Peter Pan whose threats are primarily comic rather than existential. The darker aspects, the meditations on death, the cyclical nature of danger, the symbolic resurrection of lost children, are largely muted or erased. Yet even within this sanitized presentation, the ghostly persistence of eternal youth remains central. The core fantasy of unending childhood, the suspension of linear time, and the possibility of perpetual play echo Barrie's original concerns. Here, the process of cultural adaptation demonstrates both the power and fragility of myth. While overt morbidity is removed, the psychological and symbolic architecture of the story, rooted in the tension between mortality and perpetual innocence, persists beneath the surface, ensuring that the narrative retains its resonance across generations. Post-war interpretations and media further illustrate the story's transformation and persistence. Steven Spielberg's Hook, for instance, revisits the Peter Pan myth with nostalgia and sophistication, exploring themes of memory, loss, and the passage of time while framing them within a palatable, family-friendly adventure. In this retelling, the darker undertones are largely symbolic, refracted through the lens of adult reflection. Peter's return to Neverland represents a confrontation with forgotten or suppressed aspects of self, loss, and unfulfilled responsibility. While the film does not depict literal death rituals or cultic practices, it echoes Barrie's preoccupation with the psychological consequences of perpetual childhood and the tension between imaginative freedom and mortality. In this sense, modern reinterpretations, whether conscious or inadvertent, perpetuate elements of the cultic subtext embedded within the original narrative, demonstrating the enduring adaptability and resonance of Barrie's symbolic structures. The persistence of these underlying motifs suggests that Peter Pan's cultural afterlife operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, adaptations emphasize adventure, whimsy, and moral clarity. Beneath that surface, the narrative continues to engage with questions of temporal suspension, identity formation, and psychological negotiation with mortality. The story's archetypal structures, the eternal boy, the spirit companion, the shadowy adversary, remain recognizable and potent across generations, providing a framework within which contemporary audiences can unconsciously interact with the same existential themes that animated Barrie's imagination. The durability of these motifs underscores the story's mythic character. Even as society selectively edits, sanitizes, or appropriates its elements, the deeper psychological and symbolic resonances persist, shaping interpretations, emotional responses, and cultural perceptions of childhood, loss, and immortality. In addition to cinematic and theatrical adaptations, literary reinterpretations have engaged with the darker dimensions of Barrie's work more explicitly. Novels and retellings in the late 20th and early 21st centuries often restore the macabre, esoteric, and psychologically complex elements excised by earlier adaptations. These reinterpretations frequently highlight the original story's allegorical engagement with death, trauma, and the liminal spaces between childhood and adulthood. By situating the narrative within the context of loss, mourning, and symbolic immortality, these modern retellings illuminate the enduring fascination with the narrative's cultic and esoteric subtext, offering audiences an experience closer to the psychological and ritualized intensity that underpins the earliest versions of Peter Pan. Here, the story's evolution comes full circle. What was once censored or excised returns, mediated through contemporary sensibilities, as an acknowledgement of the narrative's foundational depth and the enduring power of its symbolic and esoteric architecture. The transition from macabre allegory to sanitized children's tale thus reflects broader cultural imperatives. Post-war society, traumatized by global conflict and attuned to the fragility of innocence, sought to cultivate literature that provided comfort, moral clarity, and accessible entertainment. Peter Pan's darker dimensions, its engagement with mortality, ritual, and symbolic resurrection, were perceived as potentially disturbing or morally ambiguous, prompting editorial, theatrical, and cinematic interventions. Yet these interventions, while successful in shaping public perception, could not entirely erase the story's core concerns: the interplay of life and death, the persistence of memory and absence, and the suspension of temporal and psychological constraints. In this way, the cultural evolution of Peter Pan demonstrates the resilience of myth. Even when filtered, adapted, or sanitized, the narrative's psychological, symbolic, and archetypal structures continue to exert influence, echoing Barrie's original engagement with grief, imagination, and ritual. Contemporary adaptations and reinterpretations continue to reflect this dynamic. From stage productions to graphic novels and film reboots, modern creators grapple with the tension between surface-level innocence and deeper psychological complexity. Even when the material is consciously geared toward children, themes of eternal youth, symbolic peril, and imaginative transcendence resonate, often unconsciously evoking the cultic, ritualized subtext of Barrie's early manuscripts and private correspondence. Disney's later reinterpretations, live-action adaptations, and darker literary retellings all exemplify this duality. The narrative can be enjoyed as playful adventure while simultaneously functioning as a subtle meditation on mortality, memory, and psychological persistence. The cultural afterlife of Peter Pan, therefore, is not merely a linear history of adaptations, but a layered, multidimensional process in which the story's mythic, symbolic, and psychological cores continue to shape perception and creative engagement. Ultimately, the evolution of Peter Pan reflects both societal transformation and the enduring potency of Barrie's original vision. While post-war adaptations stripped away overt morbidity, the narrative's ghostly core, the tension between mortality and perpetual youth, the psychological resonance of imaginative play, and the symbolic engagement with loss, remains palpable. Modern retellings, whether consciously acknowledging these subtexts or not, perpetuate the story's exploration of childhood, death, and resurrection. The myth of Peter Pan thus exemplifies a dynamic cultural afterlife, a narrative simultaneously transformed, sanitized, and yet inseparable from the darker, ritualized, and psychologically intense elements that first animated its creation. In tracing this evolution, it becomes clear that Barrie's work continues to occupy a liminal space between innocence and morbidity, fantasy and psychological ritual, ensuring that the symbolic and cultic dimensions of Neverland remain an enduring, if often hidden, part of the story's cultural legacy. Neverland, in its enduring conceptual and cultural form, operates as more than a fantastical playground or a children's story. It is a mirror reflecting the deepest anxieties, desires, and psychological mechanisms of human consciousness. Across the psychological, spiritual, and historical dimensions explored in Barrie's life and work, Neverland emerges as a recurring archetype, a space in which innocence, death, and the suspension of temporal consequence intersect. It embodies our collective yearning to escape mortality, yet simultaneously confronts us with the paradox of eternal youth. The preservation of innocence cannot occur without the negation of experience, the suppression of memory, and, ultimately, the ritualized erasure of the self. In this sense, Neverland functions as a form of eternal return, a symbolic enactment of humanity's recurring confrontation with fear, loss, and the relentless passage of time. The psychological dimension of this archetype is central to understanding its enduring power. From the earliest drafts and private manuscripts, Barrie's depiction of the Lost Boys, Peter Pan, and the liminal geography of Neverland reflects a complex interplay between desire and dread. Children inhabit a perpetual present, unburdened by the obligations and responsibilities that accompany maturation, yet this freedom is inseparable from exposure to danger, dueling adversaries, and the spectre of death. The cyclical narrative structure of Neverland, where peril is recurrent, losses are reversible, and play endlessly renews itself, mirrors the psychological dynamics of trauma, mourning, and coping. Just as the alleged Neverland Society and other esoteric circles used imaginative ritual to confront mortality while preserving innocence, Barrie's narrative orchestrates a continual confrontation with existential fear, mediated through imagination, ritualized play, and symbolic rehearsal. Neverland thus functions as a space in which the unconscious is externalized, fears are enacted safely, and the tension between vitality and mortality is perpetually explored. Spiritually, Neverland resonates as a liminal domain, a threshold between life and death, memory and forgetting, presence and absence. Barrie's fascination with flight, ephemeral companions such as Tinker Bell, and the recurrent motifs of symbolic resurrection under this liminality. Flying in Neverland becomes a metaphor for transcendence, a temporary suspension of the mortal condition, a ritualistic liberation from gravity that mirrors spiritualist ideas of ascension and communion with the unseen. The cyclical repetition of adventures, the near-perilous duels, and the recurring triumphs of the Lost Boys and Peter Pan collectively echo the structures of spiritual and occult practices aimed at mediating the fear of death while sustaining the vitality of the living. In this way, Neverland functions as both a psychic and spiritual laboratory, testing the human desire for immortality while acknowledging the inherent impossibility of fully escaping mortality's shadow. The cultural dimension of the archetype further illuminates its enduring relevance. In post-war society, and particularly in contemporary global culture, the themes of eternal youth, nostalgic retreat, and resistance to aging have taken multiple forms, from anti-aging industries to digital memorialization and the curated perpetuation of selfhood on social media platforms. These modern obsessions echo the same psychological dynamics at work in Neverland, a desire to suspend time, to preserve vitality, and to create a controlled, mediated environment in which mortality is deferred or symbolically negotiated. The Neverland myth, in this sense, persists not merely as a literary narrative but as a cultural model, shaping behaviors, fantasies, and even technological practices oriented toward the deferral of death and the preservation of identity. Whether through aestheticization, ritualized play, or digital curation, the archetype of Neverland continues to seduce, offering a promise of immortality, innocence, and control over the inevitable. The interplay between fantasy and fear is particularly striking in the context of contemporary nostalgia and mediated memory. Just as Barrie's manuscripts and lost drafts suggest the deliberate preservation of absent energies and the symbolic resurrection of the dead, modern societies engage in analogous processes through memorialization, digital archiving, and nostalgic consumption. The recreation of past experiences, the curation of memories, and the idealization of childhood function as cultural forms of ritual forgetting. The trauma of loss and the inevitability of death are managed through imaginative or technological constructs, echoing the psychological mechanisms explored in Barrie's work. In this sense, Neverland remains a potent symbolic touchstone, a space in which fantasy and ritual intersect, offering both comfort and confrontation, delight and disquiet, play and profound existential meditation. The archetypal structure of Neverland also reinforces its psychological and cultural resonance. Peter Pan as the eternal boy embodies the human desire to preserve vitality and innocence indefinitely, yet his figure simultaneously signifies the consequences of perpetual suspension, the avoidance of relational development, the confrontation with repeated danger, and the symbolic negotiation of mortality without full resolution. The Lost Boys collectively represent the societal and cultural impulse to preserve youth, yet their narrative arc, repetition, and dependence on Peter's guidance underscore the inherent vulnerability and incompleteness of this preservation. Tinker Bell, Hook, and other recurring figures function as symbolic agents of liminality, threat, and desire, reflecting the complex interweaving of play, fear, and ritualized confrontation with mortality. In these archetypal roles, Neverland operates as a symbolic mirror of human anxieties, reflecting both our fascination with eternal youth and our dread of the consequences of suspended temporality. The tension between innocence and mortality, central to the narrative, finds modern analogues in both personal and collective obsessions. Anti-aging technologies, cosmetic industries, and digital attempts at immortality illustrate the same underlying psychological impulse, the desire to forestall death, maintain youthful vitality, and negotiate the passage of time through ritualized or mediated means. Cults of nostalgia, whether through media, literature, or immersive experiences, echo the ritualized play and symbolic repetition that define Barrie's original conception of Neverland. In these contemporary contexts, the archetype functions not only as cultural metaphor but also as psychological template, guiding behaviors, shaping desires, and offering the symbolic promise of transcendence from mortality. The endurance of these motifs demonstrates the universality of the underlying dynamics, transcending historical, social, and technological boundaries while remaining rooted in the archetypal tension between innocence and loss. Moreover, Neverland's archetypal resonance extends to the ethical and existential dimensions of human experience. By confronting mortality symbolically, yet offering the sustained possibility of imaginative play and ritualized return, the narrative invites reflection on the limits of human control, the consequences of deferred responsibility, and the moral dimensions of immortality. In this sense, Neverland functions as a psychological laboratory, allowing readers and audiences to rehearse existential dilemmas safely, to confront fear, experiment with identity, and explore the tension between freedom and vulnerability. The cultural persistence of the myth underscores the enduring relevance of these existential concerns, demonstrating how Barrie's creation continues to mediate, shape, and illuminate the human encounter with mortality, memory, and imagination. The eternal return of Neverland, then, operates on multiple intersecting levels: psychological, spiritual, cultural, and ethical. It offers a space in which fears are enacted and contained, desires are pursued and ritualized, and temporal constraints are suspended without full resolution. Modern engagements with the myth, from digital archiving to nostalgic media, from anti-aging preoccupations to literary reinterpretations, demonstrate the continued potency of the archetype, revealing how the symbolic architecture first embedded by Barrie resonates across time, culture, and technology. Neverland, in this light, is both a historical artifact and a living psychological landscape, perpetually renewed through human imagination and cultural practice, reflecting the recurring tension between desire, fear, and the inevitability of mortality. Ultimately, Neverland exemplifies the human compulsion to construct symbolic worlds in which mortality is negotiable, innocence is preserved, and imagination mediates fear. Barrie's narrative, rooted in personal tragedy, cultural anxieties, and esoteric preoccupations, provides a template for this enduring archetype, one that continues to resonate in contemporary society. The myth's power lies in its capacity to combine play and dread, innocence and danger, ritual and fantasy, producing a recurring space in which the eternal return of imagination mirrors the eternal return of fear. As such, Neverland remains a seductive, complex, and psychologically rich domain, a mirror not only of childhood and creativity but of the human confrontation with death, the passage of time, and the perennial desire for transcendence. In tracing the trajectory of Peter Pan, from the shadows of J.M. Barrie's personal grief to the global ubiquity of the narrative, one encounters an unsettling convergence of innocence and mortality, imagination and ritual, play and death. The story begins in the intimate darkness of Barrie's life, the untimely death of his brother, the emotional imprint of loss, and the formation of deep, ambivalent bonds with the Llewellyn Davies boys. These early experiences, suffused with grief, desire, and the urgent, almost compulsive engagement with childhood vitality, laid the foundation for a narrative that simultaneously celebrates and conceals mortality. Peter Pan, the boy who would not grow up, emerges not merely as a whimsical protagonist, but as a symbolic figure navigating the liminal space between life and death, memory and oblivion, presence and absence. The story's enduring power lies in its capacity to make this tension pleasurable, or at least compelling, while masking the existential and ritualistic forces that animate it. Throughout the preceding sections, we have seen how Barrie's work intertwines literary invention, personal trauma, and occult symbolism. Lost drafts and letters suggest the author's engagement with esoteric practices, spiritualist ideas, and ritualized imaginings of resurrection. Neverland itself, whether conceived consciously or emerging unconsciously from these experiences, functions as a psychic and cultural laboratory, a liminal terrain in which human desires for eternal youth, immortality, and imaginative mastery over death are projected, rehearsed, and momentarily fulfilled. The persistence of these motifs in post-war adaptations, cinematic interpretations, and modern cultural reimaginings illustrates the archetypal power of the narrative. Even as cheerful colors, comical pirates, and sanitized adventures dominate the surface, the underlying structure, flight, danger, ritualized cycles, and the eternal return of childhood, remains intact, exerting influence on imagination and behavior alike. The story's conclusion, in this light, is less an endpoint than a reflection of the trajectory it has traced from trauma to myth, from imagination to cultural archetype. Peter Pan, smiling and irrepressible, functions as guide, trickster, and psychopomp, leading both the lost boys and successive generations of readers toward experiences that are at once playful and profoundly existential. The narrative's cyclicality, the repetition of peril, and the suspension of temporal consequence echo the dynamics of ritualized engagement with mortality. The story enacts a rehearsal of death, a controlled confrontation with absence, and a mediated negotiation of grief. In doing so, it renders both the pleasures and anxieties of youth intelligible, while allowing audiences to inhabit a space in which mortality is temporarily deferred, symbolically mediated, and aesthetically experienced. Yet beneath the layers of playfulness and nostalgia lies an uncomfortable, almost spectral truth. Peter Pan embodies the human compulsion to deny, evade, and ritualize death. The fantasy of eternal youth, while deeply appealing, is inseparable from the erasure of consequence, the suspension of experience, and the symbolic negotiation of absence. In modern terms, this is reflected in contemporary obsessions, anti-aging industries, digital memorialization, nostalgic curation, and cultural attempts to prolong vitality through mediated means. The archetype of Peter Pan, the eternal boy, functions as a mirror, reflecting humanity's persistent fear of mortality, our desire to control time, and our simultaneous attraction to the allure of the irreversible. By tracing the narrative back to Barrie's life and psychological landscape, it becomes clear that what is masked as innocence is often an elaborate, culturally sanctioned denial, a ritualized projection of the fear of death into play, imagination, and story. The emotional resonance of this denial is compounded by the interweaving of personal and collective mourning. Barrie's real-life connections with the Llewellyn Davies boys, the tragic trajectory of their family, and the imaginative memorialization enacted in Peter Pan exemplify the intricate interplay between grief and creativity. Writing, storytelling, and imaginative play become forms of psychic preservation, ritualized restoration, and symbolic resurrection. The narrative, then, operates simultaneously on multiple planes, as entertainment, as psychological coping, as cultural myth, and as a subtle enactment of ceremonial mediation between presence and absence. This multi-layered function ensures that Peter Pan retains its complexity, allowing readers, audiences, and subsequent creators to engage unconsciously with profound psychological and existential dynamics while remaining ostensibly within the realm of fantasy. The cultural persistence of the myth, despite repeated sanitization and adaptation, speaks to the universality and durability of the underlying archetype. From Disney's cheerful animations to Spielberg's nostalgic reimaginings, the figure of Peter Pan continues to mediate the tension between vitality and mortality. Even in adaptations that consciously remove the macabre or occult undertones, the core dynamics of perpetual youth, liminal spaces, and symbolic resurrection persist, subtly guiding audience engagement with ideas of memory, absence, and imaginative immortality. In this sense, Barrie's narrative demonstrates a unique capacity to embed esoteric and ritualistic structures within culturally acceptable frameworks, producing a story that entertains while perpetuating symbolic engagement with the ultimate human anxiety, death. The narrative's final image of Peter Pan leading us, eternally smiling, toward the next adventure, or the next flight, is both exhilarating and unsettling. It encapsulates the tension at the heart of Barrie's creation. The promise of eternal freedom and unending play is inseparable from the symbolic encounter with mortality, the perpetually deferred confrontation with loss, and the subtle seduction of denial. In this moment, the narrative's pleasures are inseparable from its existential implications. The reader is invited to participate in the flight, to suspend disbelief, and, simultaneously, to confront the structural reality of absence, impermanence, and the impossibility of permanence. Peter Pan functions as both guide and mirror, reflecting the human desire to transcend mortality while simultaneously revealing the cost, ambiguity, and complexity inherent in that aspiration. By bringing the narrative full circle, from Barrie's personal traumas to the cultural afterlife of Peter Pan, we recognize the story's dual character. On one hand, it is a cautionary tale, a demonstration of the psychological and cultural mechanisms by which humans attempt to deny, negotiate, or symbolically forestall death. On the other, it is a mirror, reflecting enduring anxieties, desires, and archetypal structures that remain central to human experience. The fantasy of Neverland, far from being a simple escapist narrative, enacts a subtle, persistent engagement with fear, loss, and imagination. The story reminds us that the pleasures of fantasy are inseparable from the truths it conceals, and that even innocence can be deeply entwined with ritual, grief, and the symbolic negotiation of mortality. Ultimately, the legacy of Peter Pan is simultaneously beautiful, disturbing, and instructive. Barrie's creation demonstrates how trauma, imagination, and symbolic mediation can coalesce into enduring myth. The story's enduring power lies in its capacity to engage audiences on multiple levels: emotional, cultural, psychological, offering both delight and disquiet, fantasy and reflection, play and ritual. As we follow Peter across the skies of Neverland, we are invited into an imaginative space in which the eternal return of childhood conceals the perpetual return of existential confrontation, where every joyous flight is shadowed by the unspoken presence of absence, and where the promise of eternal youth is inseparable from the recognition of its impossibility. In the final reckoning, Peter Pan is both guide and sentinel. He leads us to laughter and adventure, to delight and imaginative liberation, yet he also escorts us, invisibly, toward the threshold of mortality. His smile is timeless, his flight unending, yet the destination remains a place we cannot fully inhabit. The final flight, the one that never lands, is simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, a symbolic embodiment of humanity's enduring negotiation with death. Through this lens, Barrie's work emerges as a profound meditation on desire, fear, and the imaginative mechanisms by which we attempt to confront the inevitable. The story ends, as it began, at the edge of understanding, hovering between play and ritual, innocence and mortality, inviting reflection, complicity, and enduring fascination.